is no small ask. I appreciate that very much. I'm going to share my screen with everybody. I hope that you can all see the slides now with the title page.
I can.
Thanks, Maren, for confirming. Appreciate it. And I'll basically talk through the basic ideas of the paper, and I'll speak more to the South African case because my colleague Carol Ann Spreen is more the United States part of the paper. But as I go, I hope you'll see how that case is illustrative of some of the key points we wanted to make and why we deployed the theoretical lenses that we did. So, various forms of lockdown, institutional closure, government-imposed restrictions in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, they raised quite difficult and dilemma-ridden debates about how and when to reopen key social institutions, and including those was, of course, schools. Now, schools affect almost everyone on the planet. Only child-free households are not directly affected, but they even then experience indirect consequences of school closure. And so how to reopen schools and to do so safely almost affected everybody. And it rapidly became apparent that the restrictions necessary for containing the spread of the virus didn't bite equally hard on everyone, and that prevailing contours of advantage and disadvantage strongly predicted how different groups and communities could weather the pandemic storm safely and securely. So COVID-19 has amplified pre-existing social inequalities in almost all forms: cultural, material, spatial at various scales, from the domestic space to international geopolitical relations, necessarily therefore racialized, linguistic and gendered relations were all brought forward by the pandemic. And so by deploying some of the theoretical work of Nancy Fraser, particularly some of her latest work on boundary struggles and contradictions between capitalism and care, and some of her more well-known work around social justice, some of these apparent dilemmas became a little bit more clear. Schools are simultaneously sites of production of future labor, as well as social reproduction through care work, and hence become contested by different interest groups who might, for various reasons, prioritize one of those roles over the other. This prevailing institutionalized social order, to use Fraser's term, favors those who prioritize production over reproduction. Now, looking at the South African case is really illustrative, what I'd call a telling example rather than typical one, because it's one of the most unequal societies in the world. And so it can tell us a lot about this amplification and the way that this prevailing institutionalized social order relates to schools. But also by considering how different responses have been constructed regarding what to do about schooling in the pandemic, we can start to think about the generative structures that made COVID so deadly for some people and a minor inconvenience for others. Firstly, I'd like to just suggest a shift in perspective. It seems necessary to me that in order to not detach COVID from its conditions, we shouldn't be talking about how COVID produced a so-called crisis in schools. What it has done is forced almost every family with a school-going child to confront a latent in the existing arrangements of schools and their relations to other social institutions and practices. So that is, this moment is unusual because most of the time, most people are not confronted with these dilemmas so sharply between education and staying safe, for example. And least of all, the hegemonic classes don't tend to be confronted with these. So rather than producing the crisis, it's made these contradictions a lot more publicly visible. I'd also personally ask whether using the word crisis isn't creating some unintended problems for understanding these issues, because it's taking the frame and wondering at what point do we say crisis began. If you were critiquing neoliberalism, you would say that this has been a crisis of 30 years, perhaps 30 years in the making, but the word crisis almost implies an event that or some kind of a decisive moment. But we've been saying that for 30 to 40 years. If you took a different frame, for example, if you took the crisis of South African education, South Africa has never had an equitable, adequate or fair education system. Not in the 100 years of being a union, not in the 250 years of colonialism before that, certainly not in the last 26 years since democracy began. So when did the crisis begin? And what does this absence of a beginning do to our ability to imagine its end? I'd suggest that the word crisis has two unconsidered effects. If it's an event, a watershed moment, it holds our attention in this existing moment, and it decouples us from a long arc of history that produced where we are, as well as a long arm into the future that we would need to imagine in order to address the situations we face. So I would worry that sometimes saying everything is constantly a crisis leads to what Pierre Bourdieu would call an amnesia of genesis. It tends to reduce problems to the contemporary and forget about its history. I'd also argue that a constant discourse of crisis produces what I'd call a civil fatigue, and also reactionary forms of activism that treat the problem as one located in the now and not one that has taken a very long time to be produced, and hence will probably take a long time to reimagine and undo or construct something alternative. So I just wanted to raise this because Nancy Fraser does use the term crisis, and she uses it in the very common sort of commonsensical kind of way. And when I quote her, I use her words which include the word crisis. But I just wanted to raise these caveats about the discourse of crisis and perhaps some of the things we should be wary of when we constantly talk about crises all the time. Particularly the fact that even though it might be a crisis for privileged groups, some of the problems that we call crises have been problems for marginalized groups for decades, if not centuries. So rather than talking about the crisis in education produced by COVID, I suggest we rather talk about the realities of education shown up by COVID. And then we try and deploy some robust conceptual tools to think about the roots of this reality, what might be undergirding the status quo, and making superficial change possible, but deeper change a lot more challenging to think about. Okay, here goes Fraser. She gives us a lot of tools to think with. The first idea I want to pull out of her toolbox is what she calls an institutionalized social order. And in Fraser's terms, this is the idea that capitalism is more than just an economic form or even a political economic form, but it permeates every sphere of social life. It goes into the home, into cultural forms, into the identities of self, and extends beyond class struggles. It's also gendered and racialized, and extractive and productive of what we now call the Anthropocene. So Fraser coins the term boundary struggles to try and broaden our idea about what capitalism is as it relates to our social formations, and to understand these antagonisms between whose work is exploited and whose is expropriated, whose work is waged and whose is not, whose resources matter because they're claimed as property by the privileged, and what constitutes alleged free gifts of nature to be consumed and polluted. And though she does periodize the institutionalized social order in order for us to understand how capitalism changes forms, she does trace it all the way back over what has been, like Ellen Mason's Wood's work, looks at about 500 years of the development of this system. Fraser calls the contemporary arrangement of this institutionalized social order globalized financialized capitalism, what most people normally call neoliberalism, and that has been the dominant social order initially in the West and now obviously more ubiquitously, bar a few notable exceptions. But most importantly, one of the most characteristic parts of this particular form of capitalism is its disavowal of social reproduction as a concern of the state. And rather than as a necessary foundational prerequisite for production, social reproduction is cast as a target arena for marketization and commodification as well. That includes like privatizing healthcare, privatizing schooling, privatizing care for the elderly, etc. Here's one of the quotes where she really gives us a sense of this. So she says, comprising both affective material labor, often performed without pay, social reproduction work is indispensable. And without it, there's no culture, no economy, no political organization. No society that systematically undermines social reproduction can endure for long. Today, however, a new form of capitalism society is doing just that. The result, a major crisis, not simply of care, but of social reproduction in the broader sense. And she goes on to notice that it's one strand that a whole bunch of other strands, economic, ecological, and political, and they all intersect and exacerbate one another. But the social reproduction strand forms an important dimension of the general problem, and it's neglected in discussions which focus on economic and ecological strands. And she calls this a problematic critical separatism. In general, then, capitalist society separates social reproduction from economic production, associating the first with women and obscuring its importance and value. But paradoxically, they make official economies dependent on the very same processes of social reproduction whose value is disavowed. On the left here, you'll see a quote, a clip from a movie, which I really recommend you go and have a look, Paris Je t'aime, 2006, in which a young Hispanic woman has to leave her own baby in foster care every morning to go and look after the child of a wealthy woman. And it really encapsulates exactly what Fraser is talking about here, when she says that globalized, financialized capitalism has relocated manufacturing to low-wage regions and recruited women into the paid workforce, promoting state and corporate disinvestment from social welfare. By externalizing care work onto families and communities, it has simultaneously diminished their capacity to perform it. The result, amid rising inequality, is dualized organization of social reproduction, commodified for those who can pay and privatized for those who cannot. By privatized here, Fraser is not talking about private markets, she's talking about families bearing the burden alone with no support. Okay, so we've got this idea of a socialized, institutionalized social order and its particular relations between production and reproduction. But Fraser's better known for her work on theories of justice, particularly different axes of justice around economic, cultural, and political parity of participation. And that these tend to be axes that persist through schooling systems around the world, which reproduce distinctions in economic and cultural terms, and often lack political frameworks to remedy such inequities. The work of Pierre Bourdieu is very clear on this. Pam Christie in South Africa has done a lot of work on it, amongst others. But useful to consider in COVID, I think, is her work on frames of justice, where she talks about the who and the how of justice disputes and how they're decided and the scope or limitations of the scope on them. And in this, she explores how the common unit assumed for justice, which is the nation state, is increasingly blunt for addressing localized issues and increasingly impotent in the face of international forces and flows of both financial capital as well as discursive ideas. Now, Fraser offers us the all-affected principle to consider as how to decide the frame of justice for a particular issue or remedy. In a case of schooling, this is a really difficult principle to apply, because surely everyone who's affected by inequities and interruptions in schooling, well, who's affected? Surely affected by everybody, or everyone is affected. And so while the all-affected principle doesn't help a huge amount, it is useful to notice what Fraser calls an abnormal moment of justice, where the grammar of justice, appealing to national courts, appealing to states for intervention through policy, is ill-defined and fluid. And the COVID moment has shown exactly what Fraser was going on about. The fact that we had to close national boundaries, deploying national state apparatus, that was our de facto response to the virus. We don't have alternative apparatus to deal with problems except nation statehood. And yet, national governments' relative capacity to respond was directly aligned with how much they had yielded or retained a modicum of regulatory oversight and authority over private interests and markets at national and international levels. We'll explore that a little bit more later. Ironically, at the same time, transnational cooperation was absolutely necessary for the pandemic response. So international cooperation needed, for example, to produce the necessary knowledge to combat the pandemic quickly. And yet, international competition for scarce resources such as personal protective equipment and vaccine rights has really shown up the worst of free market dynamics. And I like this quote from Bourdieu, where he warns us not to let off nation states too easily, when he says it is paradoxical that states have initiated the very measures that have led to their own disempowerment. Contrary to the claims of advocates and critics of globalization, states continue to play a central role by endorsing the very policies that tend to consign them to the sidelines. So before we just sort of say, well, it's globalization and shame, some governments can't do anything about it, I think Bourdieu's got a point there. Unfortunately, such a sort of frame abnormal justice moment is also primed for what Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism. And the situation where Bourdieu and Fraser describe, where states have kind of handed over the car keys to private interests, has left the door wide open for these types of interventions. COVID has not been a disaster for everyone. For example, the share prices of Amazon, Netflix, Zoom, they've gone through the roof during this pandemic. And that's particularly for companies like Amazon, who pay next to no taxes that would have funded the public health facilities required to respond to COVID. David Harvey, in his recent podcast, The Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, recently described, I found it very poignant, the way he described this policymaking arena as one of gridlock. He says the key is gridlock. Corporations don't want an activist government. They want a government to be frozen and unable to act. If it's unable to act, the only thing it can do is deregulate. And so there is this primed moment for key actors to take advantage of COVID in this way. The third part, and perhaps the most important tool I pull out of Fraser's box, is her typology, of justice responses. And she talks about affirmative versus transformative responses. And the primary distinction here is that affirmative responses are quite superficial forms of redress. They only treat the symptoms of an issue, rather than transformative responses, which attempt to tackle deeper structural issues that get to the root cause that produced injustice in the first place. And we'll see that these two notions are particularly useful for thinking about different offered responses to schools and COVID. But in general, the former, affirmative, is what David Harvey has started talking about as the restoration of capital. And you can see why Fraser might be concerned with that, given her institutionalized social order. Okay, how do we think about schools? Schools are sitting in a double role. They are producers, in scare quotes, of future skilled labor, which is the sort of human capital theory about how schools work and their role in society. But they also provide functions of care and reproduction, child development, health, safety, growth, and generally tend to be where children spend most of their time outside of the home, where they're under adult supervision that is developmental and formative. And so Fraser's observation about how families are decapacitated to perform their own social reproduction helps us notice how families depend on schools for support, and particularly those that are more vulnerable, whether they're struggling to perform their own care work for lack of time or lack of economic means. And this double positioning of schools raises different, often antagonistic relations that are valued and also enacting of values at work in schools. And the contestation of these amongst different parties, including students, parents, teachers, government apparatchiks, and the broader public debate. So this tension between schools as producers of future labor versus humanistic pursuits, between sites of political, economic, and cultural reproduction versus emancipation, are well documented. But COVID has really magnified the contradictions inherent in schools as sites of production and reproduction, and this has been most keenly felt in schools that serve marginalized. So I said that South Africa was a telling case, and this will give a sense to those of you unfamiliar with that system, a little bit of a taste of why. We have huge, persistent historical inequities in our system that we have not managed to address since the dawn of democracy 26 years ago. Our public system is approximately 24,500 schools, serving approximately 13 million learners. But within that system is deep, deep, deep inequality. About 60% aren't allowed to charge fees because the government says we'll send you approximately about £50 more per child, to give you in British terms 1,000 rand. And 40% are allowed to charge fees to the parents, but they don't get that extra £50, more or less. And that's a hang-up of the negotiated settlement that we organized with the outgoing nationalists in the middle of the 1990s. But of those who can charge fees, actually, many of the parents can't pay. So there's only a very small elite set of public schools who serve wealthy families who actually shore up the school's finances through parents' fees. 10 to 15% of our public system will triple or more the funding sent by the government. So if the government sends, say, for illustrative purposes, £1,000 per child per year, the parents will pay £3,000 to £5,000 per child per year, just to give you a sense of it. And everybody else has to just make do with what the government sends, which really is not actually enough to cover costs. A little visual illustration. That's what a really posh public school in South Africa looks like. And we don't use public in the sense of English. You use public to actually donate private. This is actually a government funded school. It'll be one normally built for white children during the apartheid era or even before. This is a school that will serve children, mostly black children coming from township areas, so peri-urban areas with mixed forms of housing and mixed forms of being serviced by public transport. And that's an example of a school that would have been built in the former homelands, which were, of course, denoted by the apartheid system as the 13% of the South African territory where black people were actually allowed to live and own land. And schools, they weren't even government funded at all. Communities had to make do with whatever they could get their hands on. The posh section is less than 10% of the system, and the poor section is more than 90% of the system. And so within a public system, all of which take funds from the state, you have enormous economic and material inequality. This is another example for those unfamiliar with the South African case. The dots on this map are the schools in South Africa that at the start of lockdown in April of 2020 lacked basic toilets and running water. Now, those of us familiar with the history of South Africa will know that those almost perfectly align with the Bantustans of the apartheid era. So 26 years into democracy, we still have more than 3,000 schools, or more than 10% of the system, who lack the basic infrastructural needs to adhere to, for example, sanitary measures for COVID, like washing hands. Unsurprisingly, those are all schools almost exclusively attended by poor black learners. And the inequality is complex. The posh schools, the 10%, I call them fortified schools, and they're heavily subsidized by income from parents. They're normally middle-class families who speak the language of schooling, English, and the minority in Afrikaans. Good home environments with internet connection, books and food security, class sizes of 25 to 30 because they hire extra teachers with those fees. And you contrast that with the exposed schools with no substantial subsidization, serving poor families who are economically struggling. The home environment is often crowded, not always a stable structure. The local neighborhood is also often, but not always, unsafe. And classes can be in excess of 50 students. The inequality is by economic means, by geography, and by language. And thanks to apartheid, that's of course racialized. Now you slap COVID on that. The students at fortified schools started online learning immediately. Their homes have data, electricity, devices, and appropriate spaces. Literate parents who are able to help, and the children need less mediation because they're working in their home language. They also have food security. That's 10 to maybe 20% of the system. Students at exposed schools, no internet beyond their cell phones if they have a cell phone. Data is extremely expensive in South Africa. There's an unfortunate issue here where the poor get price gouged because they're buying in small units. If you have connectivity at all, deep rural areas don't. These students need a lot more mediation from their teacher. They're often learning in their third, fourth, or fifth language. The adults in the home are often unable to support. There's a lot more domestic labor to be done, and especially girls get roped into this if they're at home. And out of 13 million children in our public system, 9 million are on a school feeding scheme. That is, they're dependent on food they receive at school in order to meet their basic nutritional requirements. And that's more like 80 to 90% of the system. So COVID didn't make this, but you can imagine how it amplified it. And there were a lot of contradictions during this lockdown. Only the wealthy could go online, and the poor students lost out on learning while schools were closed, hence putting pressure on reopening schools. But in South Africa, of all the children who enroll in grade 1 in a particular year, less than 30% of them will get to grade 12 years later. So schools for the poor are struggling to enact any kind of learning anyway, even under normal conditions, without a pandemic. 9 million children depend on a school-organized feeding scheme for food security. But not all the students can go back at the same time while maintaining physical distancing. And most students are taking overcrowded public transport to get to school. So the schools are overcrowded and the taxis are overcrowded. And so some children are going to be missing out on a meal anyway, because we can't let all the kids come back to school at the same time and keep them safe. Students are at home alone while parents need to return to work. One of the biggest issues that happened in the lockdown in South Africa was that people literally started starving within a few weeks of not being able to bring in economic work. We have a huge informal economic sector. Most people are living on weekly wages or some kind of informal cash-based transaction, and people really started struggling for food, not just children. And so parents needed to return to work in order to put bread on the table. And the argument was the children can't be at home alone. Unfortunately, this is a problem for working class parents anyway. Work hours when you take public transport in the wee hours of the morning, come home late at night, do not coincide with school hours. Another argument put forward was that children don't get too sick from COVID, and hence reopening schools is the better thing to do given these other problems I've outlined. But unfortunately, we have very high incidences of comorbidities in South Africa, teachers included. And there was a very real concern, particularly amongst students, that they were going to be silent vectors of the disease, not only to their teachers, but also to their vulnerable loved ones back at home. So there were all these contradictory tensions and different ideas about what should be done. One of the most dominant discourses in South Africa was one that effectively, when you scratch on the surface of it, was favoring the production role of schools. The prevailing discourse was we have to save the academic year, the idea being that we cannot stop the school throughput pipeline, if you like. Particularly the focus was on grade 1s, which is the first year of schooling in South Africa, and grade 12s, which is the final year. And the idea was, what are these students going to do? We're going to have a doubled grade 1, and we're going to have grade 12s who can't move on to tertiary education. But unfortunately, this pipeline in South Africa fails all the time. Many grade 1s are enrolled twice because we lack early childhood centres for children, and so their parents send them to grade 1 early as a place to keep them safe during the day. Of the grade 12s who write their final exams each year, less than 30% of them, remember they are only 30% of the ones who started altogether 12 years before, 30% of that 30% will get a bachelor's pass that gets them access to university. The other 70% do not get an adequate pass to move on to university at least, and many also not for vocational education either. And so this pipeline idea that there's a throughput problem and hence we must open schools to keep the pipeline moving doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. Another one was the taboo of automatically promoting students through, even if they hadn't finished all the material for the year and they clearly had not mastered the requisite curriculum. But again, this was a bit of an ironic argument because in South Africa, we have such a difficulty in enacting meaningful learning and teaching in our basic education system. Most students are pushed through every year anyway. And so there was this irony that we do this as a norm, and yet when a once in 100 years pandemic strikes us, we don't want to do it. It seems a little strange. Those going also for this particular relation, or what was valued, was concerns about exposure and transmission being downplayed, people being told, well, you're going to get sick anyway, and you'll be fine, and children don't get sick. You're just as likely getting sick if you go to the shops. And along with some rather technicist framings of science says if you just scrub the desk, you won't get COVID, without considering the conditions and contexts of that 90% of exposed schools I was talking about. So yes, if one can adhere to social distancing measures, you probably will reduce your chances of getting infected. If you can wear personal protective equipment, you probably will reduce your chances of getting sick. But those exposed schools can't do that. They can't wash hands because they don't have water. They can't physically distance because they have 3 children squeezed at a desk. They can't avoid contact with each other because they're sharing textbooks, etc. And so there was this technicist framing of the science says you'll be fine that didn't appreciate what the vast majority of South African schools are like. Unfortunately, some of these ideas assumed what I would call a veneer of care. And that does sound quite dismissive, but I feel that it's warranted because parents must be able to go back to work was one of the arguments. And yet these are people who have constantly ignored the fact that parents always have childcare problems. The argument children need to eat was totally ignoring the fact that children are food insecure during holidays, on evenings and in weekends, and that their families are food insecure too. Plus, the opening proposals only admitted half of the children back to the school at any one time. So at any one point, half the children were not going to get food anyway. Children aren't safe at home. This one was unfortunately a very unpleasant line of discussion in South Africa, which ignored the fact that unfortunately children aren't safe at school either. We do have a lot of school safety problems, but also was a very tacit type of deficit discourse around the households of poor people, as if by being poor you're necessarily violent or prone to child abuse. And that kind of ignored some of the issues around deficit, framings of poor people, as well as, of course, abuse that does happen in wealthy homes too. And so all these ideas around, oh, but the children are better off at school, ignored the conditions that children go to school in, and was always imagining those fortified schools, those well-off schools, as if every child goes to a school like that. And I would say these were affirmative responses. The primary driver, every time anyone kind of pushed a little at the children are safer, or you won't get sick from COVID, really it came down to, but we must save the academic year. School has to keep producing future workers. And it also came with an unfortunate sort of client service provider type of relationship, with parents withdrew fees saying school isn't happening, so why should I pay? And openly condemned teachers, public teachers, saying, well, if you don't want to reopen schools for safety reasons, no work, no pay. So basically, government shuts down schools for safety reasons, and then teachers are told that they're not going to get their salaries. And often teachers are the breadwinners of working class families in South Africa. And so there was like quite a strong kind of focus on the value is about being productive. If you're not getting through the curriculum and you're not producing students' results, well, your value is questionable as an institution. The alternative ideas that were coming, I would say, were favoring the more reproductive role of schools and had a prevailing discourse of health and well-being. The priority was physical and mental health of students and staff, a lot of anxiety and issues around people being very stressed about not only just returning to school, but also economic precarity or losing loved ones to COVID. And this conversation tends to be a little bit more honest about how little learning would actually take place at school if they were reopened. I mean, not much learning is happening anyway because of the vast inadequacies of provision, even under normal circumstances. And now you wanted to add on top of that screening and closing if someone is sick, and constantly disinfecting the school and constantly monitoring students and social distancing measures and timetable churn. So the idea that actually learning will happen was questionable if schools reopened under pandemic conditions. And also this was about foregrounding the contradictions that these schools that are constantly being denounced in public discussion as failing, as dysfunctional, as inadequate to the job, are now all of a sudden safe havens and beacons of hope and learning because COVID has arrived. And that's a little bit of a 1-2. And so puncturing this normative discourse whereby schools that have been consistently condemned are now being positioned as places of sanctuary, learning and safety was, also part of trying to puncture the same discourse of the homes of the poor being dangerous places lacking in care, instead of looking at the forces that cause poor people to have to choose between earning and performing care work in the home. The part Fraser says about the way that the current institutionalized social order decapacitates families to do their own care work at home. This conversation also was trying to look for a deeper transformation of the system through the abolition of fees and hence the decommodification of schooling, loosening this very tight coupling we have in South Africa where schooling is learning and learning is schooling, and trying to say actually you can learn even though you're not at school, and not everything that we're teaching at school is necessarily what we should be thinking about for a more just and fair society. And so there was this foregrounding of the contradictions, like I said, that forced poor families to choose. And I think these were trying to get at more deeper structural issues. I think they would be considered more transformative responses using Fraser's language. And some of the advocates for that position saw COVID as a moment to value relations of care over relations of production, to reorient the public schooling system towards its different priority, to repair ailing infrastructure, decouple food security from school, reimagine learning as a community activity, offer risk-free opportunities to teachers to improve their practices, reincorporate semi-privatized and some now almost bankrupt for lack of fees, those semi-privatized public schools back into the public system, and to foreground the absence also of non-teaching care workers such as counselors and psychologists who are needed in schools. Now, the e-learning response was a very popular one in South Africa and was being punted by many middle-class pundits online and on the airwaves. Most were valuing curriculum coverage and the preservation of the legitimacy of end-of-year assessments. And the concept of holistic support for students, psychosocial care, etc., all fell to the family, not being able to be done through online. And the advocates of such position also just failed to notice that this was forms of datification of students and so could be framed as a form of disaster capitalism, and that the platforms employed were often privately owned or are often privately owned and have end user license agreements that are not favorable to their users, like Google Classroom and things like that. And the irony is that the production both needs reproduction and yet undermines it. And so I think e-learning has an interesting angle there where the focus of e-learning is mostly the production of human capital, and there isn't as much of a focus on the psychosocial and holistic development or emancipatory education of the child. And yet the family still needs to provide all that in order to make sure the child is in a state appropriate to sit down at their computer and learn. So we've got transformative versus affirmative. I'm aware we are short on time, so I'm just going to give the last idea I have to offer you, which is that in enacting those, the frame, as Fraser says, becomes a problem. So in South Africa, decisions are split for education between national and provincial competencies. One example is that one province governed by the opposition political party literally defied an order from national to postpone school reopening by a week. Provincial delivery competency also just totally hamstrung national for basics such as emergency water provision. But also at the supranational was the hamstringing of a national fiscus by international financial forces, ratings agencies and structural adjustment pressures. And honestly, our incumbent government has embraced the prevailing institutionalized social order. It is despite local, discourses to the contrary, the ANC government has never really considered alternatives to a capitalistic state as a form of political economy since the advent of democracy. And so Fraser reminds us that we can't forget political questions about the hollowing out of democracy by market forces at both the corporate capture level of public institutions, at the level of the state, and also the usurpation of political decision-making power at the transnational level. And that's part of her different frames and this moment of abnormal justice that she talks about. And so where does that leave us? Fraser's language, I think, gives us some rich ways of thinking about what COVID has unearthed, if you like. And the South African case is a stark example, but the issues I've described are not unique to South Africa. They're just particularly sharp here. Noticing schools' position in the interstices of being production of future labor and reproduction in forms of care, which, who is valuing which and by whom, and how is that packaged, how is that sold in discursive terms, can help us to see different types of responses a little bit more clearly. And it's not a pretty picture that's painted, especially when one considers the framing problems. But I'd argue if we're going to genuinely think our way out of these concerns, we really do need to first have a good handle on the nature of the problems in front of us. And I think that Fraser's language can help us to get that grip a little bit more solidly. And so I'd like to end with a quote from Arundhati Roy, who I think somehow makes Marx even more poetic, if it was possible. That another world is not only possible, she is on her way. And on a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. You gave us a lot to think about. We have 15 more minutes, and I would like to invite questions and comments, please, by colleagues, but also by students. Please, Sarah, if you please ask any questions that you would like to ask. Just click on the hand if you want to say something, or just speak. Maybe the easiest. John? You're muted, John. Yeah, no.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Maren. Sarah, thank you for your talk. It was really fascinating, and I loved your analysis. I think it's great to hear about the South African context. So I was kind of wondering, and whether you might want to sort of say a little bit more about what might happen next, and the kind of, you mentioned transformative imaginaries. Because I think quite a few of us who'd been looking at social justice issues in education in the UK and in other contexts had thought about the sorts of arguments you're making in your analysis, that this is a moment which really reveals a lot of the inequalities and the problems that we have, and yet this phrase, never let a good crisis go to waste, is one that's taken up by all sides, right? And it really has been those in positions of power who seem to have, I think, maybe entrenched their advantage, and people who would look to transform systems have been, I think, maybe less effective at. So I'm interested in what we can do next, and in particular how we can try and embed these kind of transformative imaginaries, like more broadly within kind of public discourse, because I think I had hoped that in the UK, like, people would be having like radical conversations about, why we are assessing students, not just how can we get back to make sure that assessment is happening. And there doesn't seem to be those conversations about whether or not assessment is something that we should be emphasizing in the way that we always have. There doesn't seem to be that kind of critical reflection. So yeah, just an invitation to kind of respond about the challenges of embedding our transformative imaginaries in public discourse. But yeah, thank you. I love the talk.
Thank you. No, you're absolutely right. I think some of Harvey's latest analysis about the difficulty of trying to organize and to communicate alternatives right now is incredibly hard. I think in the paper we talked about the sort of the most serious abrogation of the human right to assemble and organize that we can have in living memory. I mean, what is one to do when your natural apparatus or your natural tools of getting together, having meetings, discussions, pickets are kind of chopped off at the knees? And regarding particularly, as you say, returning to assess, so many of the teachers I've been in conversation with have said, we haven't come back to learn, we've come back to test the students, because the system demands that kind of symbolic ritual in order to justify its own logic. I do wonder, however, though, if we're not being a little impatient on that front, in the sense that wait for the next year's assessments to come out, and then people may be starting to question whether there's a validity issue regarding that. However, you're right, it is a difficult struggle to constantly wonder why people are so comfortable with systems that are so blatantly against their own self-interests. Again, I would refer back to some of Harvey's thinking on this about the different moments one requires in order to start forging that transformative imaginary. One of them is to shift the discourse, is to shift the conversation, whether we do that through trying to do social media campaigns, or participating in more classic forms of public sphere participation, whether that's, you know, broadcast media, etc., or written media. And it's not an easy thing to do, but one of the part of that transformative imaginary, I would argue, is that clearly the older fashioned tools for trying to organize and share ideals that are more socially justice oriented have not been working, and they cannot work under the current conditions, nor should we think that they've been working given what 40 years of neoliberalism has done to steamroll over, for example, labor organization. So there really is, for us, I would argue, a challenge of creativity about how do we start to imagine new ways of shifting not only discourses, but also organizing and getting people to feel safe in saying no, not individually, but collectively. I don't think that the old tools are going to work. We need to start thinking of fresh and creative ways of doing that. But you're right, it's no easy challenge, not at all.
Thank you. Any other comments? Emily.
Hi, thank you so much, Sarah. I also, yeah, wow, just super inspiring, your talk. My question actually was along similar lines as Professor Owen's, and I guess it mainly revolves around the idea of power to implement like, you know, these transformative imaginaries. It seems like as it stands, there's power in the government, and then there's power in the market or money as social drivers. Do you see any like possibility for power to make those transformations happening in other places? You kind of mentioned like labor unions, like they tried, but it seems like to have those kind of imaginative discourses that are more than just discourses, but actual changes, we would have to have power shifts in some way. Do you see that? I mean, what do you think that would look like? What would enable that?
I wish I had concrete answers. There are always just glimmers of hope when I watch what some of those kids did that Trump rally using online organization. It's a minor activity, it's a small thing, but that kind of thing makes me think there's a creativity there that someone of my age just doesn't entirely appreciate. That's not obviously enough, but it's a difficult question to answer, and you're absolutely right. I'm not sure one person should come up with the answer to that either. That half the point is that what that does should be a collective endeavor. For my own part, I've been organized in different issues here in South Africa with community organizations. It's interesting that the dilemmas inherent in this COVID schooling situation that I outlined here were shot through all the organizing that I was involved with. So whether that was a more middle class kind of apparatus that tried to get activists and NGOs and academics together, or where it was more a grassroots community thing with principals and teachers and parents, all these things about, well, the kids are hungry. No, but the kids still need food. Oh, the kids, no, but their parents are going to get sick. Created the most unbelievable tensions and fractures in what nascent structures existed. And what that, for me, was about was that we cannot wait for moments like COVID to have structures in place on the ground. The organizations that were most able to lobby for social justice issues in the COVID moment were those that had been putting in place grassroots structures, membership, and solidarity for a good 10 years prior to COVID. And so I think that that's part of the crisis stuff I was talking about earlier in the talk. Whereas when we think of crisis as an event, we tend to locate our imaginations in the present. And if we do that, we are going to constantly castrate ourselves from knowing how long it takes to build solidarity and resistance, and also how long that solidarity and resistance needs to persist into the future to tackle these issues on these kind of scales and complexities. So I don't know what the answer is, but I do know that waiting around for events is a problem that I think people with social justice imaginations need to be wary of.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. Great question. And very
lovely
difficult
question.
One. Very tricky
Thank
one.
you so much. Yeah.
Any other comments, please? Or questions? No? John again. Okay.
I don't want to ask another question if other people have some, but
yeah, I'm in the same. Yeah. I'd rather have other people ask questions. No, go ahead, John.
Okay, well, very briefly. So I know Nancy Fraser has written recently about the importance of trying to sort of shift the neoliberal hegemony, sort of shift public imagination and discourse away from progressive neoliberalism, as she frames it, towards something like progressive populism. And she wrote recently in American Affairs about the importance of understanding the kind of nationalistic populism as like a threat to neoliberal framings in public discourse in the States. So she was talking about the threat that Trump and maybe Brexit and other sort of movements have towards neoliberalism. I was just wondering about the South African context. Does COVID and the kind of COVID crisis help a shift towards something like the kind of progressive populism in South African politics that Fraser talks about? I'm just wondering about, whether the Democratic Alliance or any of the other opposition parties or the ANC, for example, they're likely to move towards the kind of progressive populism that Fraser advocates, or maybe not.
I think South Africa, when we wrote the paper, people said the education systems of South Africa and the United States are not very good comparators. They're different sizes, they're different developmental stages, they're different linguistic terrains. But the one thing that I think South Africa and the US have in common is a very similar kind of political terrain. We lack what I would call a legitimate left kind of formation politically, at least in terms of organized politics. And one of the ways that our, for example, trade union movements here was somewhat neutralized was the way that it was bundled in with the ANC as part of the tripartite alliance in the mid-1990s. And so actually, unfortunately, no, the progressive populism that Fraser discusses is about as likely here as it is in the US at the moment. We are much more seeing a regressive populism. There's sort of South Africa first, and people resorting to what would, I guess, be called essentializing identity discourses, premised on fear of the other, which is rather sad, but it seems to kind of be keeping with the trends happening around the world right now. One of the things that might be of some source of help in the South African case is a fracturing of that tripartite alliance. We recently just had a massive call by COSATU, the major trade union federation that's in alliance with the ANC, for a massive strike last week. So there might be some opportunity there for Labour to get out of bed with capital, which has been the case for the last 26 years, and something may come of that. There's certainly been a lot more offshoot independent trade unions that have left expressing their discomfort with that COSATU tripartite alliance, but they are still quite small at the moment. They're still minorities. But if we can get a big fracture in that, then who knows, there might be gaps and opportunities for change. But right now, I'm afraid our political landscape doesn't look too unlike the US.
Okay, any other questions? Otherwise, I'd have one.
Yes, please.
Okay, Yeah, first of all, I wanted to ask you a little bit about what's the situation right now? So are the schools open again? Are they partly open? So what does it look like right now?
Very good question, actually. Our schools have mostly reopened. We are having some very interesting trends in terms of how COVID seems to be moving around South Africa right now. One of the things that I think we had to tackle earlier than a lot of the global north countries, maybe excluding Australia and New Zealand, who had quite different responses to us, is the way that our academic year falls. So we got COVID just into about a third of our academic year, whereas for the Northern Hemisphere, it came just in your final semester. And so a lot of your summer was spent at home anyway. And one of those, the most, what's the word I'm looking for, staunch supporters of those affirmative responses about kids should go back was citing a lot of medical evidence that children are not vectors of COVID. And then as soon as the schools in the US and England and France went back, all of a sudden there was this plethora of evidence, oh dear, actually reopening schools is a problem. And this person looked a little bit silly because they'd been saying, well, England says schools are fine and the US says schools are fine and Korea says schools are fine. I'm like, yeah, because England and US and Korea schools are closed. So of course they're not worried about this question right now. And so we had a moment where COVID coincided with winter, COVID coincided with our schooling year. And we seem to be in a state where community transmission is down. And people aren't quite sure why and whether we're going to get a second wave. We certainly have a younger population than a country like England, for example, or Spain or Italy. That might have something to do with it. We might have just had a sort of brush fire of infection that passed through with our testing wasn't really telling us adequate levels of infection rates. Whether we'll get a second wave or not, we don't know. But for now, schools are open in a way that children are alternating. So some grades go back on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, some go back on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which is part of the problems of school feeding and child safety, etc. I raised. And exams are steamrolling ahead. That's been a huge, massive source of contention. People have shifted their focus from school opening to exam legitimacy because our grade 12s, our school leavers, are still going to be writing the same exam that has not had any kind of scope change, even though we lost almost a third of the school year. And so right now, the push from activists is whether those exams should be treated as credible and legitimate or not, which comes back to your point, John. That's where we're at right now. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sarah. As it is 2:01, I think we have to come to an end. Yeah, I just wanted to say that I told Sarah before that we read the paper in the political economy class, and several of the students are here. And I thought that it's a great paper, and it also came out in your presentation to think it gives us so many tools and concepts to think about this situation, such as the fortified institutions, for example, and the exposed institutions. And we could relate that also to the context in the UK, where it's very similar with and around the world, where the inequalities are coming out, and there are the fortified institutions that can go online and are pretty much equipped for this change, and others that are just not, and the students don't have the connectivity, don't have the means, and just fall behind. So thank you so much for coming, Sarah. This was really interesting. And I would like, before I let you go, as usual, the next, I'll tell you the title of the next CPPR Lunchtime Seminar, which will be in 2 weeks' time on the 27th of October, on a Tuesday this time. And the speaker will be Carmen Nicuara, who is a PhD student in political economy research. And she will talk about, can human capital be supplied as a club good? An analysis of apprenticeship underinvestment in advanced manufacturing England. And I will send a reminder. Okay, so let's give an applause to Sarah at the end. Everybody turn on their mics. Okay, thank you so
Sarah.
much.
Thank you so much. That was a lovely opportunity. Lovely
Sarah.
to meet you all. And I wish you all well with
you.
what's facing you for the rest of 2020. Good luck.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.
Bye, Sarah. Bye. Bye,
Bye for now.
everybody. Thanks for coming. Bye.